If you've collected the t-shirts, the toys, the uniforms, or just love watching the Space Babes, and we all do, you've probably had the discussion before, if Star Wars and Star Trek got into a fight, who would win? Regardless of what side of the aisle you come down on, there are virtues to the Enterprise, the X-Wing, the phaser, or the lightsaber, and while some are clearly superior, who's holding the winning hand at the end of the day? We've tried to answer this in a couple of different ways. One of the favorite ways we like to debate this is a technological comparison. This is a nice quantitative approach because we can talk about numbers, breaking down the technical details into, okay, who's got the bigger ship or the faster ship or the more powerful ship. And the argument usually sounds something like, Star Wars weaponry is based on lasers, and lasers aren't powerful enough to affect Star Trek technology. Therefore, Star Trek wins. But what happens when somebody builds a bigger, stronger laser? We can debate this ad nauseum. And we're also held hostage by writers who don't always understand the science.
Fast ship. You've never heard of the Millennium Falcon?
Should I have?
It's the ship that made the Kessel run in less than 12 parsecs.
Yeah, that's parsec as in distance, not time. Thanks a lot, George. We really had to retcon the hell out of that. Another favorite method is a subjective assessment, or a qualitative debate as to this would outclass that. An example is the Vulcan neck pinch. Sure, it's useful, even badass at times, but does it really compare to a force choke? I mean, Vader can kill this guy through a TV screen. He's not even in the same room and he's choking him out. That's kind of tough to get around. Now, the value of using a fictional science or biased opinion to bring closure to this is debatable. So I'd like to take a slightly different angle on it. Does the use of a storytelling trope or convention prepare one side for victory over the other? Well, let's take a look. Now, some people will argue that Star Wars and Star Trek are actually two different genres. Star Trek is actually science fiction, while Star Wars is space fantasy. Definition of science fiction aside, I think we can at least agree that we're talking about two different ways of telling a story. Star Wars is the epic movie, the classic battle of good versus evil, as told through the quest of the hero. No, not this hero's quest. This hero's quest. Boy, that sunset's dramatic. Now, Luke Skywalker's journey is the classic hero's journey. Slaying the beast, becoming the hero of legend, the face-off between good and evil on a truly epic scale. And we get a little redemption story folded in, but again, it's mainly quest and confrontation. Star Trek, on the other hand, remains in its heart episodic TV, a philosophical debate on moral issues. We don't generally see good and evil, and when we do, it's generally wearing a small pointy beard. Instead, we get social commentary on racism or man's struggle against his own violent nature, often while the crew's seated around a conference table, at length. Now, this moral debate generally comes as a choice between a strictly logical course of action or a more emotional response, with a path of wisdom found somewhere in between. If you don't believe me, take a look at this.
Obviously, their weaponry is superior to ours, and they have a practical invisibility screen.
You're discussing tactics. Do you realize what this really comes down to? Millions and millions of lives hanging on what this vessel does next.
Or on what this vessel fails to do, Doctor.
Yes, well, gentlemen, the question still remains. Can we engage them with a reasonable possibility of victory?
Boom, boom, boom. Told you. So, one's a TV series, the other's a movie. How does this help us decide who's going to win in a fight? Oh, shut up, I'm getting there. First step, we're going to take a look at the Star Trek episode Balance of Terror. If you don't remember, this is the one where the Romulans first decide they're going to cross the neutral zone. They've got a new bird of prey which can cloak and has got a massive superweapon capable of destroying Federation outposts with a single shot. After some debate on answering violence with violence, the crew decides to have at it. Hijinks ensue. And in fact, what we have here are the Romulans de facto declaring war on the Federation. They're violating their treaty, violating Federation space, and killing Federation personnel. and prompting the Enterprise to respond in kind. They have to cross back into the neutral zone to hunt the warbird down. So it looks like both the Federation and the Romulan Empire are setting themselves on a course irreparably to war. And in next week's exciting episode, we have shore leave. I'm not kidding, that's the actual next episode. They go on shore leave. I can understand wanting some R&R after all that, even if things don't go exactly as planned. But I think we're still left with some questions about the Romulans. In particular, aren't we worried they're going to try this again? Why is the Federation and the Empire not at war right now? Aren't we going to deal with the consequences of last week's episode? Apparently not. Apparently we're just going to go hang out with Vegas showgirls in space. But to be fair, the Enterprise's mission is exploration, and there's a lot of space out there left to explore. In comparison, I'd like to take a look at Empire Strikes Back. Now, we remember what happened at the end of A New Hope. I bet it still had that new car smell, too. And Vader's right there watching it happen. And what does he do? Well, he gathers up the boys, and they get pissed. They get real pissed. Vader is so angry, he's killing his own men when they can't toe the line. You know, I bet they promote fast in the Imperial fleet, but I don't think a whole lot of guys are cashing in on the pension plan. Anyway, after some hijinks, Vader catches up with Han Solo. He tortures him, freezes him in carbonite, and hands him over to Boba Fett, just so he can force a confrontation with Luke Skywalker, cut off his hand, and unload the mother of all bombshells. Let's hold off on the nerd slapfest for a little while longer, because what I'm talking about here is story arc and how it relates to conflict resolution. This is used in modern storytelling, even though it's not really a modern convention. It dates way back when an old Greek guy said this. Oh, sorry, here's a English translation. This dramatic structure is self-explanatory, but I'm going to illustrate how the entire Star Wars trilogy is actually one long story arc. Each of the individual movies have their own arcs, but they're all woven together, leading to that final confrontation. Again, in Return of the Jedi, at the Battle of Endor, where good confronts evil in the form of Luke versus Vader and the Emperor, and the Rebel fleet versus the Imperial fleet. And we eventually get our denouement in the form of singing Ewoks. When we apply this story arc to episodic TV, like a series like Star Trek, we end up getting something that looks like a sine wave. That is, in one week's episode, we'll have a crisis, climax, and resolution. And in the following week's episode, we'll have a different crisis, climax, and resolution. And so on and so forth throughout the series. This presents a bit of a problem for Star Trek when they're facing off against Star Wars, because it makes the crew of the Enterprise, and really the Federation in general, look like they're suffering from ADD. Can't they ever just focus on one problem and see it through to the end, be it Romulans or Klingons or gaseous anomalies? That's generally not what we're thinking of when we use the word continuity, but it does present somewhat of a problem. But we're not done yet, so let's move on to round 2. Did you know both Star Wars and Star Trek are actually caste systems? Yeah, caste is in like the Indian hierarchy. Except it actually looks a little more like this. You got your heroes up here, and everybody else down here. And the heroes are pretty easy to identify. Either Han, Luke, or Leia, and yes, Chewie, although he got chipped out of a metal for some reason. Or the crew of the Enterprise. 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 And this galactic showdown has its supporting cast as well, who are also pretty easy to identify because they're generally all dressed the same, be them rebel troopers or rebel pilots or rebels freezing their asses off. Star Trek, they're again easy to identify because they're all wearing red shirts. Always. And we know what happens to guys wearing red shirts.
Captain, I see something!
Always. And this is where things get really interesting because we have to look at the question, can those who are destined to die be killed by those who seem destined to miss? And while stormtroopers have always been renowned for their complete and utter inaccuracy when it comes to firearms, I think we got to take a look at what happens the very first time we see these boys in action. Stormtroopers make the case in point, but when we look at any grunt force within the Star Wars universe, they seem pretty efficient at killing each other. So when we look at Red Shirt versus Stormtrooper, we have to give it to the Stormtrooper. The problem is that actually doesn't matter. You see, in both Star Wars and Star Trek, like a Greek saga, the only guys who actually matter are the heroes. So if we're looking for somebody to win this thing, it's going to be one of these guys. Or maybe this guy. Or even maybe this guy. Or these guys. Or these guys. Or maybe even these guys. But probably not these guys, because the only thing they managed to kill was the franchise. Let's take a brief sidebar here. I've heard an argument that Star Trek is more populist than elitist because no one in the Federation is born to be a hero. And this is kind of delusional because Ensign Kenny here, who's scrubbing plasma filters down in engineering, doesn't have any more chance of saving the galaxy than any other red shirt. No, if you want to make a difference in Star Trek, you got to be sitting up on the bridge. And this is really true in either franchise. You have to be a Han Solo, Luke Skywalker, Captain Kirk, or Mr. Spock in order to hit that 2-meter wide thermal exhaust port right below the main port. The truth is, unless your picture's up on the poster, you're pretty much just there for dramatic effect. Accepting the premise that, like the Trojan War, any battle between Star Wars and Star Trek is going to be decided by its heroes, we now take a look at how those heroes go about their conflict resolution. Star Trek, being that episodic TV show around space exploration, generally has its crew members trying to answer those fundamental philosophical questions that arise when they meet new civilizations. And in doing so, they find themselves sitting around conference tables a lot. I mean, they really know how to sit around a conference table. And when we take a look over in Star Wars, while they spend their time around their fair share of tables too, generally there's something else going on, and it's not philosophical debate.
Yes, I bet you have.
And maybe it's just a product of being in a series that's called Star Wars, but these guys seem to be a little more anxious to go to the guns.
There's one. Set for stun.
Even those wizened old Jedi who are the guardians of peace and justice will reach for their sabers the moment the situation requires it. Those characters within the Star Wars universe aren't hesitant about employing violence when necessary, and they don't require a lot of philosophical debate beforehand. So in the final analysis, if I'm going to form a debate team, I'm probably going to choose the crew of the Enterprise. However, when I have to choose a winner on who's going to win the fight, I think the answer is actually pretty clear. In the end, the question of who would win in a fight is not the question of which one is better. That's just a matter of personal opinion. The question of who would win in a fight is an academic exercise for those of us with too much time on our hands. So, whether you prefer to boldly go or you prefer to be one with the force, let's just shake hands and agree to disagree. And if you do disagree, make your own damn video. In the end, I think the things that unite us are greater than the things that divide us, and whether you prefer Star Wars or Star Trek, both have their attractive qualities.